Hello, I'm Gordon White, and I'm here at the 2019 ADRBC Symposium. And with me is Russell Mirasty. And Russell, you were an Assistant Commissioner for the RCMP in Saskatchewan, I understand.
Yes, I was retired from the RCMP about 5.5 years ago. Yes.
Sometime. Would you be open to telling us a bit of your story, your background?
Well, yeah, I'm certainly okay with it. It's a bit of a long, convoluted story, but
that sounds interesting.
Yeah, as my bio says in the program, I'm originally from the Lac-La-Ronge Band of First Nation Northern Saskatchewan, which is actually the biggest First Nation in Saskatchewan by population. And I left there in 1976 to join the RCMP, and that career literally took me to every province and territory doing some kind of work. And I lived, I say I, but with my family in 7 provinces. And as well had an opportunity to go to the Northern Territory in Australia on an exchange. So the police work has given me a lot of different experiences, and tremendous actually.
Now, working in the RCMP it's a traditional institution, or traditional for Canada anyway, being a short-lived country, relatively. And you, I'm assuming, growing up in your band, that you had a certain sense of justice from your tradition, and I'm wondering what it was like for you to have to move into essentially, I guess, a Canadian system, if you like.
Yeah. Well, the RCMP has been around a long time. I mean, as far as Canada goes, really, since 1873, and certainly the RCMP has been a big part of most of Canada, even Northern Canada, for a long time. And so, when we talk about justice, as with many Indigenous communities, I would say or suggest that traditional forms of justice didn't exist in recent times. But there were certainly acceptable norms in terms of behavior, and there were ways of dealing with, to use a modern term, offenders that went against community norms. But because of, I guess, the government's approach to, particularly to First Nations people, and being on reserve, those systems were long not forgotten, but put aside because of the new colonial system that was imposed on people. So what I'm used to, I guess because of my age, really, and probably a couple of generations before me, that's what people were used to. And so, to answer your question, going into that, to being a participant, if you will, was foreign, but not to the degree that one might have discomfort with going from a fully or truly traditional system into the modern British-based justice system. Yeah.
So even though it wasn't as much of a shock or difference as it might have been, what kind of strategies did you have to use to adapt?
Well, one was the structure, particularly with the RCMP and its paramilitary kind of history. Certainly that was something that I wasn't accustomed to. The uniform, the marching, all kind of activities or parts of the RCMP that were very foreign to me. Certainly in training it was a learning environment, and you learned certain activities and certain skills, but that part was a little bit different for me, for sure.
So I'm going to make a little bit of an assumption here and talk about what some people might describe as the elephant in the room. So I'm assuming that in the course of your career in the RCMP that you experienced that there were instances within the force where the force was exhibiting different kinds of prejudice towards Indigenous peoples, and that you were experiencing that. And I just find that kind of amazing that you were able to, live with that. And
I mean, that's a good question, very valid. I mean, I grew up in a community, it's a First Nations community, but I guess what I left out was we were adjacent to 2 other municipalities, and that's a term that I'll use, non-Indigenous communities. Yeah. So there was a lot of integration, a lot of activities across borders, if you will, or because really it was there was no discernible kind of line, although people knew where the line was between the reserve and the 2 communities. The schools, at least when I was there, we all went to the same schools because there were no on-reserve schools. So I mention that because it prepared me in a way to step into a different world. As well, I went to university and exposed to like a bigger learning environment again, although I was, from what I could tell, I was one of very few at that time going to university. And so going into the RCMP, I was prepared for a sense of maybe isolation, if you will. But I think the important point there we have to remember is the relationship between First Nations people, say Indigenous people more broadly, and the RCMP goes back to its inception. Because on the March West, there was a relationship developed because quite literally, and people would admit this and historians talk about it, the RCMP would not have survived without the cooperation and support of Indigenous people, especially on the prairies.
And the RCMP was originally called the Northwest Mounted Police.
Correct,
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that relationship, although I'm not going to say it was entirely positive, existed, right? And so when I went in the RCMP, to jump ahead to your question, obviously there was that recognition that Indigenous people did in some small way contribute to the existence of the RCMP. Now when we talk about the elephant in the room and maybe racism, that was more individual. Certainly there were institutional practices that didn't necessarily recognize or give credit to the role of Indigenous people, never mind across Canada more broadly, but directly with the RCMP. It was never an issue while I was in training. Let me put it that way. There was one other First Nations cadet in what we call the troop, or class, of 32. And he was from Ontario, and that never came up during training at all because we were too busy to worry about who we were and where we were from. And
that's good to hear.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was very good. And even to this day, we've had recently reunions 35, 40 years later, and it's like, your best friend, and even though we may have not worked together, contacted each other over the years, so all to say that was never a real issue in training. Now, it's a much broader discussion, which I'll get into a little bit tomorrow, in terms of how the RCMP started to recognize, that there was an opportunity to engage with and bring in more Indigenous people in terms of how we provided service across Canada. So, and I guess one of the challenges when you talk about institutional racism or treating people differently is they didn't want to treat people differently. It was like, well, you're just a Mountie and it doesn't matter who you are or your background. And to me, that failed to recognize what an individual like myself brought to the organization. Whether you call that racism or whether it's just ignoring, potential assets that an individual might bring because of their background.
So this is a little differently than people might normally think about it, right?
Right.
Because you're saying it's not what sort of bothered you or what you wished might have been different was not so much that Indigenous people were treated badly or differently in that way, but that they weren't recognized for particular positive attributes that they might bring in.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, but that changed over time. And again, I'll talk about that tomorrow. For me, individually, that is. Now, I can't speak for every Indigenous member that's been a member of the RCMP, but certainly for me, I did see some change over, the 36 years that I was in the force.
Yeah. Now, not everyone watching this video will be able to see you tomorrow, and so I'm wondering if you could say a few words about the message, kind of the main message that you wanted.
About that?
Yeah, talk about tomorrow.
I think a couple of messages. One is that, I guess, and it's a reflection on the individual, and a little bit more difficult for me to talk about myself in the sense that, and I'm trying to be objective, so I see a Russ Mirasty coming to the organization, working very hard to be a contributing member of the RCMP, and obviously at some point that was recognized. And so that recognition manifested itself into support from supervisors, from leadership within the RCMP, so that in itself led to me being commissioned, which means into the management levels of the RCMP,
Yeah.
which is very difficult to get it to that level for any member, but for Indigenous members it was very, very rare. And I don't know the exact numbers, but when I was commissioned to the rank of inspector, I mean, I probably could count a handful across the country that I knew of.
Yeah.
And so there was support. It was like certain key people at certain times, whether it was just by, I don't think it was by luck, it was just, was the relationships that I developed with people recognized what I could offer. And so they supported me going to other levels because they wouldn't have. Because one of the fears, and we talked about this as Indigenous members often, quite frankly, back when I was more junior, is we didn't want to be thrust into that limelight or put to another level just because, you know, I was an Indigenous person.
You want it to be merit-based, right? If
Absolutely.
I
Yes.
deserve to be
Yes.
there, then fine.
Now,
but not,
as I said earlier, though, if I had other skills or background that I could bring to enhance what I could do and contribute to the RCMP in a broader way, then absolutely, I was okay with that. I was okay with that.
Yeah.
So, I guess back to the messages, there were very supportive people along the way that assisted me in reaching the levels that I did, right to the top.
Yeah, and I think we all know that the RCMP has had some pretty bad press in the last few years, you know. So, but being a large organization, it's certainly going to be complex on the inside, right? And you're speaking to some of the other sides, right? The other nuances, which are probably good for Canadians to hear about, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
So I think to that point, I mean, it just a lot of things would have happened, not out like visibly, that told me that there are ways to advance within the organization without making exceptions, I guess is a way to put it.
Yeah.
Finding a little difficulty finding the right words for that,
but not because you're a different.
Yes, exactly.
Not to advance because you're different, but to do it based on merit.
Right.
And be different.
Right. No, that's true. And I've used that word, describing Indigenous communities and the challenges that we face, even outside the RCMP, and the work I do now in different areas is people talk about that, and I'm okay with saying I'm different.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a different history, I have a different background. My first language is Cree, so that makes me different from you.
Yeah.
But if that can assist whatever organization that I'm with at the time, then that's great. I don't have an issue with that. Yeah.
I'm interested in language. Now that you've mentioned Cree, I'm interested in how, and I know nothing about Cree, but I'm interested in what that language is like in relation to justice. You know, if the character of the language changes the way you would think about or approach justice and fairness.
There are some differences for sure, but to go back to my earlier comment about being immersed in a foreign system and that becoming kind of the norm for us, it does change somewhat. I guess maybe the traditional views that I might have had 3 generations ago. But that's not to say that, right or wrong, if somebody is behaving contrary to community norms, then the community is going to come together and say, hey, that's wrong. I mean, that would be the difference, right? It's not, in terms of the language, you don't hear words that translate at least easily into jail, for instance, right?
Yes, a place of confinement. Or
right, it's, or court. There was no formal court system.
Yeah.
And so you don't have those specific words that that have an equivalent, I guess. And so what happens is the language is actually changed or adapted to suit that particular word, and it's often just a description of the action that's being taken, or describing a process. Yeah.
Is it okay if I change topics?
Sure.
Yeah, just like to ask you how you're finding the conference.
Conference is great, actually. I love to learn new things. I'm not an ADR practitioner, but obviously, as a police officer, conflict is a big part of the job, right? Whether you're immersed in it or trying to resolve it or trying to manage it. And I talk about that from a policing operational perspective, but to your comment earlier about the RCMP being in the forefront, not necessarily in a positive way in the press. Some of that is internal conflict, right? And so all of the topics are kind of cross all boundaries, and it doesn't matter what organization you're in or what issue you're dealing with. What I heard today was very good. I wish I would have learned some of that a few years ago.
Yeah.
No, it's very, very good.
And what final remark would you like to make about to people listening? Yeah.
Well, I guess it's back to why I'm here. I mean, it took some convincing by Elton.
To get you here?
By Elton to get me here.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know whether or not I would have a place. But after today, I feel pretty comfortable. Not 100% yet. That I fit into kind of what the symposium's about more broadly. But I think for me, it's just having the opportunity. Again, we talk about what got me to the RCMP is having, one is that open mind, but also having supportive people and encouragement. And it's interesting, if I start to look at it, and I don't want to get too deep into the thought process, but Elton convincing me, no, you have a story to tell, and I think it would fit in some ways, and just that openness, I guess, and that willingness to maybe take a bit of a chance and say, oh no, this guy does have something to tell, and we're willing to listen. So, because of that, I'm mostly happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy to have you. I think lots of other people are too.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing what you have to say tomorrow.
Great.
In addition,
Okay.
And I hope you enjoy the rest of your
Well, I think I will. And, from the agenda and the topics, it looks very good tomorrow as well.
Okay, and thanks for being willing to share a bit of your background and your perspective
You're very welcome.
to viewers.
Thank you.